Sometimes the loudest secrets are the ones hidden in silence. And when an old house begins to whisper again, the truth can no longer stay buried. Tonight, we walk a path lined with unfinished stories, ticking clocks, and one final confession that changed everything. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The narrow lane wound like a thread through the pines, dappled in golden afternoon light. As Jessica Fletcher's car turned onto the final stretch, she caught her first glimpse of Hawthorne Hollow, an elegant, slightly time-worn manor nestled into the slope of the hill like a memory half forgotten. The house exhaled old stories, the kind etched not just in paper, but in quiet, unfinished goodbyes. A young woman, Delia, if she recalled the note, greeted her at the entrance. "Miss Fletcher, it's so good to meet you. Aunt Eleanor's in the drawing room. I'll show you in." Jessica stepped inside and was immediately struck by the hush of the house, as though every book on the tall shelves had paused its whispering in her presence. The other guests arrived in slow succession, each with a suitcase and a carefully composed smile. Meera Talbot, sleek and self-possessed, scanned the room with narrowed eyes, clearly cataloguing reputations. Arthur Hemsley, stooped but stubborn, offered a stiff nod to Eleanor and said little else. And Colin Vance, once a promising writer with a voice full of quiet resentment, offered Jessica a hand and a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jessica took it all in quietly, her observations tucked behind a pleasant expression. Something about the air in Hawthorne Hollow felt pressurized, as if the weekend were a stage set for something unsaid. She accepted a cup of tea from the housekeeper, Rose, whose face remained unreadable. As Jessica settled into a worn but comfortable armchair, she caught Eleanor watching the group with a gaze not of a host, but a woman making peace with the ghosts she'd invited back in. Dinner was served in the oak-panelled dining room beneath a chandelier that had seen finer days. The place settings gleamed, and the meal itself was elegant, a testament to Rose's steady hand, but the atmosphere thickened like cooled gravy. Jessica listened more than she spoke, noting how Meera sharpened her words when Eleanor praised the tradition of old-school editing. Arthur scoffed into his wineglass when Colin spoke of narrative truth, and Eleanor, ever gracious, deflected with the polish of a hostess who'd learned long ago how to survive an editorial battlefield. But there were cracks. "You never did return my final draft, Eleanor," Arthur said, his tone light, but his eyes unflinching. "I believe I sent my notes," Eleanor replied, her fork pausing just long enough to answer without actually engaging. Jessica caught the flicker of tension between Meera and Colin, a glance quickly buried beneath a sip of wine. And Delia, seated beside Jessica, appeared attentive but strangely adrift, like someone learning new truths in real time. When the conversation turned to Eleanor's legacy, she gave a wistful smile. "I imagine the house will stand longer than I will." Jessica noted the silence that followed, deep and telling. No one reached to fill it. By the time dessert arrived, the gathering resembled less a reunion and more a carefully staged scene with missing lines. Jessica tucked the thought away. In her experience, where there's this much restraint, there's usually something waiting to be unburied. Later that evening, as Jessica wandered the dim hallway toward her guest room, a low tick, tick stopped her in her tracks, or rather, the lack of it did. A tall grandfather clock stood by the corridor's end, its ornate woodwork dusted with age, its face stilled at precisely 12 o'clock. Midnight. The hands, once golden, were tarnished. A hairline crack sliced through the glass pane like a whisper. Rose, passing silently with a folded shawl, noticed Jessica's glance. "It hasn't worked in years," she said, though not convincingly. "Eleanor said it stopped on its own, called it poetic." Jessica gave a polite nod, but couldn't shake the odd chill that slid across her shoulders. There was something theatrical about the placement, and something deliberate about its frozen moment. 12 o'clock was rarely just midnight in a story. It was a reckoning, a turning point. Back in her room, Jessica jotted the detail down in her notebook, not as a clue, yet, but as a metaphor. Eleanor had always understood the power of symbols, and Jessica had the feeling that this one hadn't been left to chance. The drawing room, after dinner, was warmed by firelight and the scent of brandy. Eleanor poured for her guests with unhurried elegance, but Jessica noted how her hands trembled slightly as she replaced the decanter. It was the kind of detail most would overlook, except Jessica never did. "I'm glad you could make it, Jessica," Eleanor said, settling beside her. "I always imagined if I were to host one last gathering, you'd be here." "One last?" Jessica asked gently. Eleanor gave a soft laugh, but it rang hollow. "Old age makes everything feel like a finale, even a weekend in one's own house." Jessica studied her carefully. Beneath the well-chosen words and composed smile was a woman carrying weight, not just age, but regret, the sort that rewrites its own pages when no one is looking. Arthur stood by the fireplace, alone, staring into the flames. Meera had disappeared early, citing fatigue, and Colin murmured something about needing fresh air. The gathering had thinned, like the final pages of a book nearing its end. Jessica watched as Eleanor gazed at the dark windows. "Strange," she murmured, "how time refuses to tell us when it runs out." And then, a second later, "You still carry a notebook, don't you, Jessica?" Jessica smiled softly. "Always." But in Eleanor's eyes there was something else. A plea, maybe. Or a warning she didn't know how to give. The night deepened into a hush, broken only by distant wind and the creak of the old house settling into its bones. Jessica had always found such hours to be fertile ground for thinking, but tonight the silence held tension. As she stepped out of her room for a glass of water, her footsteps paused near the upper landing. From below, muffled voices, urgent, low, unmistakably tense. "You promised," someone whispered harshly. "I said no such thing," came the reply, sharper, brittle, female. Jessica stood still, her hand on the banister, listening. Then silence. A door opened, a creak of floorboards. From her vantage point, she caught a shadow moving across the foyer, tall, male, hesitant. The figure paused at the entrance to the library, looked around, then slipped inside and shut the door softly behind him. Jessica waited. The clock at the end of the hall still pointed to midnight, as if time had not resumed. She retreated without sound, the whispered words echoing in her mind, promises, denials, secrets. Whatever this weekend was meant to be, it had already shifted into something else entirely. Jessica returned to her room, the chill of the hallway clinging to her thoughts. She slipped under the quilt, but left the bedside lamp on, her notebook open beside her. The page remained blank for a few minutes as she stared into space, sorting fragments into tentative shapes. Who had spoken downstairs? Meera's voice, perhaps, sharp enough to cut glass. The man? Colin, likely. The tone fit. And if so, what promise had been broken between them? She thought of Eleanor's face beside the fire, her comment about time running out. And the grandfather clock, still at midnight. Deliberate, symbolic, possibly both. There was no proof, no crime, no accusation. Only a series of small dissonances, emotional tremors that no one else seemed to hear. And yet, Jessica began to write. Old houses keep old secrets, but it's the guests who carry the dangerous ones. She paused, capped the pen, and turned out the light. Somewhere downstairs the wind teased the shutters. The house exhaled. Jessica closed her eyes, but her thoughts refused sleep. She had come for a literary retreat. Instead, she had walked into a story still being written, and someone, she felt sure, was already trying to tear out the final page. Jessica had not yet finished her morning tea when the cry rang out, a broken call from downstairs, followed by the rapid thudding of feet on the old wooden floors. By the time she reached the study, Delia stood just outside the threshold, pale and trembling, her hands clutched to her mouth. Jessica gently moved past her. Eleanor sat in her high-backed chair near the hearth, her head tilted gently to one side, eyes closed. At first glance, she could have been dozing. A crystal glass rested in her left hand, nearly empty, the scent of port clinging to the air. On the floor beside her chair was a torn page, creased and yellowed, clutched in her other hand. Jessica approached slowly, her breath caught in her chest. There was no movement, no pulse. Behind her, Rose whispered a prayer and stepped back into the hallway. Jessica took in the stillness of the room, the absence of struggle, the delicate composition of the scene. It was too composed. She knelt, gently easing the scrap of paper from Eleanor's fingers. The edges were jagged, as though torn hastily, and faint, typewritten words ran across it, broken mid-sentence. Delia's voice wavered behind her. She was fine last night. Jessica didn't answer right away. Her mind was already cataloguing what didn't fit, the peaceful position, the missing spectacles, the half-finished glass of port, and most of all, the page. Too deliberate to be random, too personal to be meaningless. It didn't feel like a death. It felt like a message. Deputy Sam Granger arrived 20 minutes later, his uniform slightly rumpled, his eyes still adjusting to the gravity of the situation. He was young, early 30s perhaps, and courteous, in a way that suggested he was used to quieter duties. "Must have been her heart," he murmured, crouching near the chair. "No signs of violence, and at her age." Jessica nodded politely but remained quiet. Her gaze drifted to the door, the only entrance to the study, which Rose had confirmed had been locked from the inside. Delia, in a panic, had found the spare key in the bureau drawer where Eleanor always kept it. Granger glanced toward the page Jessica had placed carefully on the desk. Old story, maybe? Probably just scribbling something before she passed. "Scribbling, perhaps?" Jessica murmured, "though this appears to be from a typewriter." She didn't press the point further. Granger was earnest, but he lacked the instinct to distrust appearances. Jessica, however, had made a career of noticing what others missed. She stepped once more around the study, her eyes moving from the closed window to the untouched fireplace, from the inkwell on the desk to the single impression in the seat cushion opposite Eleanor's. Someone had sat there, recently. And if Eleanor had truly died of natural causes, why was the manuscript page torn out and clutched so tightly? It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but something was very wrong. And Jessica had learned long ago that truth often hides behind well-drawn scenes. Once the deputy stepped outside to call the coroner, Jessica lingered in the study, her gaze sweeping across the desk with quiet precision. The crystal decanter was nearly full, too full for Eleanor, who'd always paced herself, even in celebration. The glass in her hand had no lipstick trace, and its base had left a faint impression on a folded napkin, forming, quite by coincidence or perhaps not, a small stain shaped like a heart. Jessica noted it silently. Symbols had a strange way of presenting themselves in moments like these, and while it might mean nothing, she had long since learned to pay attention. On the desk lay Eleanor's old blotter, the surface worn but not chaotic. A single sheet of thin typing paper had an indentation, lines pressed faintly from what had been written or typed atop it. Jessica tilted her head and saw that a recent message had been composed. Though the words were indecipherable, the rhythm of punctuation and paragraph breaks was unmistakable. It had not been random note-taking. Then there was the absence, Eleanor's reading glasses. She never read without them. Jessica recalled seeing them the night before, perched on her collar. She scanned the side table, the cushions, the mantel. Nowhere. A small detail, but the sort that whispered rather than shouted. And finally, the fireplace, a stack of fresh wood, untouched, but beneath it, tucked into the grate, the edge of a matchbook poked out from behind the logs. Jessica said nothing. She merely slipped her notebook from her pocket and began to write. Later that morning, Jessica sat alone in the small sitting room, turning the torn page over in her hands. The typeface was unmistakably Eleanor's old Underwood. Jessica had seen enough of her manuscripts over the years to recognize the slightly uneven spacing and faint smudges where the E occasionally struck too light. But it wasn't just the machine. It was the language. The passage described a fictional character, a literary editor, engaged in a confrontation with a younger writer over a long-suppressed story. The dialogue was sharp, layered with veiled accusation. It read like fiction, but the cadence, the names altered just enough, sent a slow current of recognition through Jessica. She knew this voice. Years ago, Eleanor had spoken vaguely of a story she was too afraid to publish. Not for the writing, she'd said with a wan smile, but for the fallout. Jessica had assumed it had been lost to time, or quietly burned. But here was a piece of it, torn mid-sentence and clutched in Eleanor's final moment. What was she trying to say? There was an odd kind of fear in the language, not violence, but exposure. Jessica considered the names Eleanor had invited to this retreat, Arthur, Meera, Colin, and wondered just how many shadows might be buried in their shared literary past. She read the final line again. It ended abruptly. "You don't understand. If this comes out, it will—" And then nothing. Jessica stared at the page. Whatever this manuscript was, someone had wanted it silenced. Delia sat on the veranda, her eyes red-rimmed, a blanket draped over her shoulders despite the morning sun. Jessica joined her quietly, offering a cup of tea without comment. The younger woman accepted it with a nod of gratitude, her fingers trembling. "She was more than an aunt," Delia said at last. "She raised me. I thought I knew her." Jessica placed a gentle hand over hers. "She loved you, that much was clear." Delia nodded but stared out across the garden, unfocused. "Do you think it was really her heart?" "She never complained, not once." "I think," Jessica said carefully, "that when someone passes unexpectedly, it's natural to question what we didn't see." Delia's lip trembled. "She said she was working on something. She wouldn't let me read it. Said it was too personal. Do you think—" She trailed off. Jessica didn't answer immediately. She studied the young woman's face, the weight behind her words. There was no guile there, only grief and a subtle fear that something darker lay beneath the surface. "I think," Jessica said softly, "your aunt was trying to tell us something, and perhaps she ran out of time." Delia blinked rapidly and clutched the cup tighter. Jessica turned her eyes back toward the house. The others were inside, quiet, distant, waiting. But for what? Not everyone was mourning. Some, she suspected, were wondering if Eleanor had spoken too much, and whether someone had made sure she'd never finish her final story. The afternoon drifted slowly through Hawthorne Hollow, its quiet broken only by murmured voices and the occasional clink of porcelain. Jessica, notebook discreetly in hand, began what she knew was both an inquiry and a conversation in grief. It was easier sometimes to let people speak before they realized they were revealing anything. She found Arthur Hemsley in the reading room, seated beneath a shelf of dusty hardcovers he clearly no longer cared to admire. "She had taste, that much is true," he said, not looking at Jessica. "But taste can turn cruel in the right hands," Jessica responded gently. "You knew her a long time, didn't you?" Arthur gave a dry laugh. "Too long. She published my first novel, you know, then buried the next two with so many notes and conditions I barely recognized my own sentences. Said I was losing shape, as if she were carving me out of stone instead of letting me write." He waved a hand as if shooing away an old ghost. Jessica took a quiet note of his choice of words. Later, she spoke briefly with Meera Talbot, who leaned against a garden wall as though she were expecting a photographer, not a question. "She liked power," Meera said coolly. "I admired that about her until she used it on me." "You submitted to her?" Jessica asked. Meera snorted. She rejected my first book, said it was technically accomplished but emotionally sterile. I sold it a year later. It won 3 awards. Jessica caught the flicker behind Meera's bravado, a wound still raw. She wrote me a note once, Meera added, lowering her voice. Said she was proud of me, but I always wondered. Proud of what? That I didn't need her anymore, or that I'd proven her wrong? Jessica thanked her and moved on, leaving Meera to her silence. The words spoken were sharp, but the ones left unsaid felt sharper. Arthur was waiting for her in the drawing room when she returned, arms crossed, his cane balanced across his knees. His expression was not bitter so much as exhausted, a man who had long since accepted his place outside the spotlight. She had her favourites, he said before Jessica could speak. Colin, that boy was practically groomed to be her heir, and when he failed to live up to her lofty expectations, she discarded him the same way she did me. Jessica sat across from him. Did she ever speak of regrets? Arthur narrowed his eyes. Only in the vaguest terms. Eleanor never apologized. Not really. She believed in her own judgment, believed in it to the end. Jessica let the silence hang before offering. You mentioned earlier she buried your later work. Was there one in particular? Arthur's jaw twitched. The Sleepwalker's Inheritance. She praised the idea, even encouraged the draft. Then she gutted it, said it was too dark, too self-referential. I think it hit too close to home. To her? Arthur gave a tight smile. To both of us. Jessica didn't press further. Instead, she found Meera shortly afterward by the piano, her fingers trailing idly across the keys. You once told Eleanor she'd regret passing on your debut. Meera glanced sideways. Did I? Well, I meant it. Jessica observed her a moment longer. Meera's elegance was sharp-edged, every gesture a performance honed from experience. But her words about Eleanor had not been performative. She was jealous, Meera said suddenly, of youth, of relevance, of anyone who didn't need her approval to succeed. Jessica gave a soft nod. There was pain there, older than ego. She added a quiet note to her mental ledger. Arthur, resentful, Meera, wounded. Both intelligent enough to hate Eleanor for reasons they believed were justified, but hate and guilt were not the same. And murder. That required more than bruised pride. Jessica found Colin on the back terrace, gazing toward the distant hills with a vacant expression. A cup of untouched coffee sat beside him, long since cooled. May I? Jessica gestured to the empty chair across from him. Of course, Colin said, though his tone lacked conviction. You're probably here to do what you do best. Jessica offered a gentle smile. Sometimes I ask questions people haven't considered yet. He looked away. Sometimes that's the problem. She waited a moment, letting the air settle. I understand Eleanor once promised to publish a manuscript of yours, Jessica said carefully. Colin's face didn't change at first, but his hand shifted slightly, pulling the coffee cup closer, though he didn't drink from it. She did, he said eventually. Said it was too bold to ignore. Then after the final draft, nothing. She stopped returning notes, claimed she was rethinking her editorial calendar. Jessica studied him. Do you still have a copy? Colin gave a thin laugh. I burned it. Foolish, I know, but it felt like letting go. Jessica tilted her head. Did she ever mention it again? Once, he admitted. Years later, said she'd kept a copy. I thought she was bluffing. Jessica's thoughts turned to the page Eleanor had clutched. Was the manuscript political? Personal? Both, Colin said, and neither. It was about consequence. People didn't like that. His expression tightened, not with anger, but regret. She said I wasn't ready to tell that story. Maybe she was right, but maybe she just didn't want it told. Jessica looked at the hills, her mind moving like the wind across the treetops, soft, persistent, and circling toward a truth half buried beneath pride and years of literary silence. After her conversation with Colin, Jessica returned to the library, drawn not by instinct alone, but by a whisper of memory. Eleanor had always believed that the spaces between books were where the real stories lived, and if there was a room in Hawthorne Hollow where a secret would wait patiently to be found, it was here. She walked the perimeter slowly, trailing her fingers along the spines, letting her mind settle. A deep breath cleared the remnants of conversation from her mind, and she focused on the furniture instead. Eleanor had kept the same mahogany desk for decades, polished but never pristine. Its drawers creaked with history. Jessica opened the central drawer. Manuscripts, appointment slips, a worn fountain pen, nothing unusual. But the right side drawer stuck slightly. She tested the wood along its edge and noticed a faint ridge along the bottom, barely visible unless you were looking for it. With care, she lifted the false bottom. Beneath it lay a small bundle of letters bound loosely with silk ribbon faded to ivory. Most were from years ago, correspondence with publishers, agents, friends long gone, but tucked among them was a single sheet of cream stationery, folded crisply, unsigned. The handwriting was elegant, but agitated. "You can't publish it. You know what will happen if you do. Midnight is closer than you think." Jessica read the line twice, then again, no name, no context. But the warning wasn't casual. It carried weight, fear, perhaps even desperation. She studied the shape of the handwriting, the rhythm of the ink, not Eleanor's, but someone who knew her, someone with a stake in the story she was planning to reveal. Midnight again. The symbol was no longer metaphor alone. It was becoming a threshold, a line someone did not want crossed. Jessica returned the letters to the drawer and crossed the room to a small cabinet tucked beneath the far window, partly forgotten and half-covered in a crocheted doily. She opened it on a whim and discovered Eleanor's handwritten cellar ledger. It was exactly the sort of detail Eleanor would maintain: elegant script, dated entries, notes in the margins. She had recorded each bottle taken from the estate cellar with a quiet precision. Jessica flipped through pages, noting years, labels, occasions. Then she reached the most recent entry. Last night's date. Burgundy, 1948, reserved for final toast. Guests unaware, one last pour to the truth. The line was underlined once, faintly. Then, nothing. No closing, no signature, no follow-up. Jessica stared at the words. Final toast. The phrasing chilled her, not because it confirmed foul play, but because it carried the weight of something decided, as though Eleanor had known this night would end differently, or had, perhaps, invited the ending. But guests unaware, and that was something else. Eleanor had poured something privately, a final moment, unshared, or meant to be shared with someone specific. And then there was the question Jessica could not yet answer. Did Eleanor write this with certainty or fear? She closed the ledger slowly. The manuscript, the page, the warning letter, the unfinished wine log. The pieces were gathering, but the story still bent away from clarity. Somewhere in the silence, Jessica thought, was the one thing she needed. The voice that hadn't yet spoken. The sound of rain tapped gently against the parlour windows as Jessica found Colin seated alone, once more on the terrace, though this time with his sleeves rolled and collar unbuttoned. He looked younger this way, less composed. "I've been thinking about the wine ledger," Jessica said, taking the seat beside him uninvited. "Eleanor made a final entry the night she died, a toast to truth." Colin didn't respond at first, only stared out at the garden, where vines curled over the stone wall like questions left unanswered. "She was planning to publish again," Jessica continued, "and from what I've gathered, it wasn't fiction." That struck something, a small, involuntary shift in his posture. "She said my manuscript was a bit too eager to provoke," Colin replied, voice brittle. "But I didn't write it to provoke. I wrote it because it was true." Jessica studied him quietly. Was it about someone here? Colin met her gaze. not by name, but anyone who knew the world I came from would recognize the people behind the pages, a prominent editor, a cover-up, an old betrayal swept under literary rugs. "And Eleanor?" Jessica asked. "She called it dangerous," he whispered, "not because of what it said, but because of who it said it about." Jessica folded her hands, so the manuscript had teeth, and someone, maybe several someones, had reason to fear its return. What happened after she rejected it? Colin's face was a mixture of bitterness and sorrow. "She stopped talking to me for almost a year. Then one day she sent a brief note. No apology, just the line. Some truths ripen too soon to be swallowed. I never asked what she meant." Jessica didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply made a mental note. This story hadn't just bruised egos. It had endangered reputations. Some of them, perhaps, still breathing. The afternoon waned into a hush as Jessica found Rose in the solarium, quietly watering the orchids Eleanor had adored. The housekeeper's movements were slow, almost reverent, as if she were tending memories rather than plants. Jessica approached softly. "You've worked for the Wakefields for a long time, haven't you?" "Since I was 17, Rose replied, not turning from her task. "Longer than anyone else in this house if we're counting hours over titles." Jessica paused. "And you knew Eleanor better than most." "I knew what she let me see," Rose said. "She was a woman who understood the value of silence." Jessica allowed that to settle before asking, "Is Delia really her niece?" Rose's hand faltered slightly. A drop of water fell onto a leaf. Too much, too fast. "She is," Rose said softly, "but not in the way the papers say." Jessica said nothing, only waited. Rose sighed. "Eleanor's brother, Henry, he and I. It was a brief thing. I was young. He was grieving. Delia was the result, but Eleanor claimed her, took her in, gave her a name, a future, said a house like this couldn't survive scandal, but a child deserved to grow with dignity." Jessica's breath caught for a moment, not from shock, but from the sudden shift in the emotional terrain. "Did Delia know?" "No," Rose said, eyes wet but voice steady. "Eleanor made sure of that, said the past could be rewritten if the story was told right." Jessica watched her a moment longer. Another secret, hidden not out of malice, but protection. And yet secrets, however noble, cast long shadows. She touched Rose's arm lightly. "Thank you." But as she turned away, Jessica felt the subtle weight of a question growing. What else had Eleanor rewritten? And who had been waiting for the final chapter? The grandfather clock in the hallway remained stopped at midnight, as though time itself refused to move forward. Jessica stood before it, wrapped in a shawl, notebook in hand, listening to the silence that had returned to Hawthorne Hollow, like a guest overstaying its welcome. Midnight. The symbol that had hovered like a whisper throughout the weekend. It wasn't just a time, it was a warning, a marker. Eleanor's letters, the decanter, the broken watch, the phrase in the unsigned note. Midnight is closer than you think. Jessica's thoughts turned, carefully and deliberately, like the hands of a clock might have, had they been free to move. She walked slowly through the halls, her steps muffled by the old rugs. The rooms all bore Eleanor's touch, books shelved with purpose, portraits hung in silent testimony. Each space had been curated, not simply lived in. In the study, the fire had long since gone out. But Jessica could still feel something there, an imprint. Someone had sat opposite Eleanor. Not in argument, perhaps, but in reckoning. She sat briefly in that very chair, facing where Eleanor had been found. Was it Colin, Meera, even Arthur? The motive didn't feel violent, but it felt urgent. Jessica glanced again at the faint indentation in the seat cushion, at the bookend just slightly off-center on the shelf, as though recently disturbed. She noted them without drawing conclusions. Not yet. Truth, Eleanor had written, was something you poured a final toast to, but not everyone wants the truth at the table. Jessica rose, heart quiet, but focused. Midnight had come and gone. and someone had made sure time would never move forward again. Jessica's steps slowed as she returned to the hallway, once more facing the tall grandfather clock. It loomed in its corner, mute and frozen, its hands still arrested at midnight. But now, with everything she'd gathered, the ledger, the warning note, the emotionally charged interviews, this clock no longer seemed symbolic. It seemed strategic. She studied the face again. The minute hand was slightly askew, as though it had been shifted by a hand not trained in its mechanics. Below the glass, just above the base, she noticed a smudge, a faint crescent. Grease? No, wax, candle wax. She reached for her notebook and made a small mark beside the word clock. Jessica knelt slightly to inspect the interior workings through the narrow side panel. It wasn't locked, just delicately aligned. Inside, the pendulum had been disengaged, its hook still swaying ever so slightly when she brushed the edge. She reached inside and gently lifted a fallen screw. It hadn't come loose naturally. Someone had tampered with it, quietly, perhaps clumsily, and left the time deliberately fixed. But why? If Eleanor's death had occurred earlier, or later than assumed, the timeline of every guest's movement would shift. An alibi would become a contradiction. Silence might become presence. Jessica leaned back, her eyes rising to the motionless clock hands again. No longer a symbol of guilt, but of manipulation. It hadn't stopped at midnight. It had been made to appear as if midnight was the moment to remember, and someone had counted on no one asking what time it truly was. The next morning brought with it a reluctant sun and a shifting energy in the house. Whispers lingered longer. Footsteps grew quieter. Jessica returned to the study once more, drawn by an unease she hadn't yet resolved. Something about the space around Eleanor's chair felt incomplete. Not in its setup, but in its silence. She knelt beside the desk, brushing her fingers along the rug, where the torn manuscript page had fallen. Beneath the edge of the heavy wood, where shadow lingered, something caught her attention, a small glint of metal nearly buried under the baseboard lip. Carefully, she reached in and retrieved it. A watch, gold-plated, delicate, the crystal cracked down the center. Eleanor's initials were engraved on the back in tiny, looping script. The hands inside were still. 11:58. Jessica exhaled slowly. The detail mattered, not because of what time it showed, but because it differed. The grandfather clock had lied, but this, dropped, or perhaps hidden, spoke truth without words. Jessica's thoughts ticked forward. Eleanor had been alive just minutes before midnight. The stopped watch proved it. The wine, the seating arrangement, the ledger entry, all converged in a narrowing window of time. She tucked the watch into her pocket and turned her gaze to the chair opposite Eleanor's. She had assumed the visitor to be Colin, or Meera. But as she stepped around the desk again, she noticed a faint impression, scraped into the wooden floor near the chair leg. A cane mark. Arthur. Later that morning, Jessica found him seated near the fireplace, sipping tea with a trembling hand. "You said you retired to bed early," she said gently. He looked up. "I did?" She tilted her head. "Before midnight." His eyes hesitated, just long enough to answer her. "I may have wandered the halls. I've had trouble sleeping lately." Jessica nodded, the line delivered with just enough deflection. A man proud enough not to lie, but pained enough to conceal. Had Arthur visited Eleanor to reconcile, to argue, or simply to confess something before it was too late? She didn't know yet. But the cane mark beneath the chair said one thing clearly. Arthur had been there, and Eleanor had been alive when he was. Jessica stepped out of the study and paused in the hallway, her thoughts brushing against the edges of the story that had begun to take shape. Not a clear narrative, but a tapestry of contradictions stitched loosely together with silence and pride. She reviewed what she knew. Eleanor's ledger ended abruptly. Her watch stopped at 11:58. The grandfather clock had been tampered with. Arthur had lied, or at least withheld. Colin's manuscript had teeth. Meera's resentment smouldered just beneath her practiced calm. And yet, none of them had seemed quite ready to kill. But then there were the inconsistencies, small but persistent. Eleanor's glasses were still missing. The wine glass had no fingerprint smudges, no lipstick. And Meera, for all her pointed remarks and late-night movement, claimed to have spent the evening alone after dinner reading, a claim no one could or had confirmed. Jessica recalled Meera's conversation with Colin the night before Eleanor's death. She had overheard tension, but not enough to suggest violence. Still, something in Meera's behaviour nagged at her. Her pride was precise, but her fear, buried beneath layers of disdain, had started to show. Jessica pulled out her notebook and jotted 2 words, missing motive, then a third, or shared. There was more here than a clash of personalities. Someone, or more than one person, was hiding the real reason the manuscript mattered. And the longer Jessica listened, the clearer it became. The true story wasn't about ego or literary rejection. It was about something much deeper, something someone had risked everything to silence. Jessica found Meera in the garden, leaning against the wrought iron railing that overlooked the damp hedgerows. The morning mist curled around her, a veil as deliberate as the one she wore around her words. "I imagine," Jessica began gently, "that few things are more dangerous than a story that threatens to tell the truth." Meera didn't turn. "Dangerous?" she echoed, "and inconvenient." Jessica stood beside her. "Eleanor's manuscript, it wasn't just about Colin's fall from grace, was it?" Meera finally turned, her expression wary. "You think it was about me?" "I think it was about all of you," Jessica replied. "Eleanor had a gift for names and shadows. She could fictionalize without disguising. That's what made her stories sharp and dangerous." Meera exhaled. "Colin sent me a copy once, years ago, before Eleanor rejected it. He said I'd see myself in it." "Did you?" Meera nodded, slowly. "I had just started in publishing. There was an author I helped bury. Not literally, of course, but I was part of the pressure that made him retract an exposé. He drank himself into silence. The story never came out. I told myself I was too young to fight back. But the truth is, I didn't want to lose my place." Her voice broke slightly, not from tears, but from the burden of memory. "When Eleanor read Colin's manuscript, she recognized my part. She told me she would change the name, but it wouldn't matter. Anyone who knew would know." Jessica listened without judgment. And if that story had been published? "I wouldn't be standing here," Meera whispered, "and neither would my career." Jessica made no comment. She simply filed the confession among the others. The manuscript hadn't just stirred guilt. It had illuminated complicity. The more Jessica considered the fragments she had uncovered, the more the manuscript shifted in her mind, not as fiction, but as memoir cloaked in metaphor. A mosaic of truths arranged so carefully that each character mirrored a living soul, not a creation of the imagination. Eleanor had always understood that the sharpest knives were the ones dulled by elegance. And this story, Death at Midnight, wasn't meant to entertain. It was meant to reveal. Jessica returned to the library and retrieved her notes. Meera's confession had given weight to her suspicions. Colin had written the story, yes, but Eleanor had reshaped it, had restructured it through her own lens, a co-authorship, not of formality, but of purpose, which meant that every guest invited this weekend had a reason to read, or fear, those pages. Arthur with his accusations, Meera with her guilt, Colin with his humiliation, and Delia. Jessica hesitated. Delia had seemed untouched by the literary wars of the past. But now, with Rose's revelation about her parentage, the edges of Eleanor's motivation sharpened. What if the manuscript wasn't meant for the world? What if it was meant for Delia? Jessica circled the name in her notebook. Not all stories are told to indict. Some are written to unburden, and others to warn. Jessica found Delia in the upstairs hallway, eyes red but purposeful, a small box cradled in her arms. She looked startled when Jessica appeared. "I was looking for, I don't know, something of hers," Delia said. "I went into the attic. It's dusty and half frozen, but there's a trunk up there, and this was inside." Jessica gestured to the box. "May I?" Delia nodded and followed her down to the sitting room, where they placed it carefully on the table. Jessica removed the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were printed proofs, pages bound with twine and annotated in Eleanor's sharp, looping handwriting. Some bore deep underlines, others had entire paragraphs struck through, but one title sat atop the pile: "Death at Midnight." Jessica's fingers hovered over the cover before lifting it. The manuscript's opening lines were familiar, the same voice, but the pages, these were different, richer, refined, polished in a way Colin's draft had not been. It wasn't just edited, it had been transformed. Delia watched her. "Is that what she was working on?" Jessica nodded. "It's the truth, told through fiction." She turned the pages slowly, absorbing the characters, their parallels, the emotional weight Eleanor had poured into each scene. "It's all here," Jessica said softly. "The betrayals, the concealed scandal, the regrets. But it isn't just an exposé, it's a reckoning." Delia leaned in, as if drawn toward a flame. Did she mean for this to be published? Jessica closed the cover gently. "I believe she meant for it to be found." There was silence between them, not heavy but reflective. Then Delia spoke again. "She wrote this for me, didn't she?" Jessica looked at her and saw Eleanor's eyes. "Yes," she said. "I believe she did." Jessica sat in the quiet of the sitting room, the manuscript open across her lap, pages feathering gently beneath her fingers. The late afternoon light softened the room's corners, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the words on the paper. Words Eleanor had chosen with surgical care. Each chapter unfolded like a confession disguised as fiction. The characters were thinly veiled, recognizable not by their names but by their actions, their mistakes, their patterns of silence. Meera, ambitious and complicit. Arthur, proud and betrayed. Colin, young and wounded by a system that claimed to nurture. And Rose, always watching from the margins. But it was the emotional terrain that gave Jessica pause. The story Eleanor had told wasn't angry. It wasn't even vengeful. It was quiet, painfully honest. A narrative built not on accusation but on revelation. These weren't villains she had described. They were people. People who had chosen comfort over conscience, reputation over responsibility. Jessica found herself at a passage in the final third. Some truths must be written, not to wound, but to free. And in that freedom, perhaps there is still time for forgiveness, if not from others, then from ourselves. She sat with that sentence for a long moment. It was no longer a question of who had motive. The manuscript was motive. But not because of slander or scandal, because of fear. Fear of collapse, of disgrace, of exposure, not to the world but to oneself. Jessica closed the folder softly. It wasn't rage that had driven the hand behind Eleanor's death. Rage was loud, unrefined. This had been something else. A decision made in silence. A plea, perhaps, for control before the truth made its way to light. Jessica's gaze drifted toward the corridor, toward the clock, still silent, and the study, now so carefully preserved. The manuscript hadn't just been a story. It had been a reckoning, and someone still in this house, had believed their only way forward was to stop it before the final chapter turned. But the final chapter, Jessica thought, was already written, just not yet spoken aloud. The sky outside darkened into a gauzy grey as thunder murmured low over the hills. Rain pressed softly against the windows of Hawthorne Hollow. Jessica stood by the hearth, her hands clasped loosely, her tone calm but deliberate. "Would you all join me in the parlour?" she had asked earlier, with a gentle insistence that didn't invite refusal. Now they were gathered. Meera perched tensely on the edge of a settee, Colin leaning forward with his hands folded, Arthur standing near the bookshelf, cane steady but unreadable. Delia, uncertain but attentive, sat nearest to Jessica, as if seeking warmth from her steadiness. Jessica waited a moment, letting the hush settle. The storm had not yet broken, but its promise hung thick in the air, as though the house itself held its breath. "I've spent much of the last day trying to understand not just how Eleanor died," Jessica began softly, "but why. And while we've all shared pieces of our pasts with her, some willingly, some less so, I believe she left behind a story not to condemn, but to confront." A faint creak in the floorboard as Arthur shifted. Meera crossed her arms defensively. Colin's gaze flicked to the manuscript Jessica had placed gently on the table, the pages closed but weighty. "She invited us here," Jessica continued, "not for nostalgia, but for closure." Another silence passed, pregnant, but not yet ready to deliver what waited beneath it. And Jessica, in her careful way, knew that to break that silence, she had to begin with truth, not accusation. Not yet. Jessica's voice, measured and free of drama, carried just enough clarity to still the room. Eleanor's death was made to look peaceful, a glass of port, a locked study, but certain things didn't align. She moved toward the table, opened her notebook. First, the grandfather clock. It appeared to have stopped at midnight, symbolic, poetic. But when I examined it more closely, it had been tampered with. The pendulum disconnected, a screw left loose. It hadn't stopped on its own. Someone wanted us to believe it had. She let that linger before continuing. Then I found Eleanor's watch, cracked, likely dropped, but not broken from age. The time was frozen at 11:58, 2 minutes before the clock's midnight. Arthur's brow knit faintly. Meera's fingers twitched where they rested against her knee. Jessica turned a page in her notebook. There was also the matter of her reading glasses, missing from the study. Eleanor never read without them. Yet she had a torn manuscript page in her hand. That same page, I now believe, was taken from a manuscript she didn't write alone. Colin began it, Eleanor shaped it. And the final version, Death at Midnight, contained truths that implicated everyone in this room. Colin's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but Jessica gently held up a hand. "I'm not here to shame anyone, but Eleanor planned to leave that story behind. She wrote in her wine ledger, 'One last toast to the truth.' She poured herself a final drink, and someone, afraid of what that truth meant, made sure she'd never take that sip. The room remained motionless. She wasn't poisoned violently," Jessica continued. "There were no signs of struggle, but there was a second glass. It held traces of something she didn't intend to drink." She turned to each face in turn, measured, empathetic, relentless. "I don't believe she ever knew she'd been drugged. She simply fell asleep, quietly, permanently." A long, low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Jessica closed the notebook. "I believe the question isn't who hated Eleanor, but who feared what she was willing to tell." No one spoke at first. The rain had begun to fall more insistently now, tapping at the windows like an impatient messenger. Jessica reached to the side table where she had carefully placed 2 crystal glasses, both identical to those found in the study. "I had the contents of this second glass tested," she said, her voice steady, "with help from the local clinic. There were faint traces of a compound called siloderal, a herbal sedative, rare but not unknown. It's tasteless in small amounts and fast-acting." She paused. "It would have slowed Eleanor's pulse, lowered her blood pressure. In someone her age, it would have looked like nature had taken its course." Delia turned pale. Meera glanced away. Arthur closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming something he'd long suspected. Jessica continued, Siloderol isn't easy to acquire, but it is used occasionally in rare book conservation, applied to cloth gloves or brushed into drying agents to calm unstable bindings. The house's cellar, in fact, still had a tin, half used. She turned her gaze to Colin. You handled many of Eleanor's older proofs, didn't you? He nodded slowly. Years ago, yes, but not recently. I haven't been near that part of the house. Jessica didn't press further. She turned to Meera. You knew about Siloderol. You've worked with rare texts. Meera hesitated. I know what it is, yes, but I haven't touched a conservation kit in years. Again, Jessica didn't challenge, not yet. Then finally, to Arthur. You were seen outside the study that night. Your cane left a mark on the floor. Arthur's eyes narrowed. I went to speak with her, that's all. We argued. I left. What time? I don't know, just before midnight. Jessica nodded. But there's something none of you knew, she said. The sedative wasn't just in Eleanor's glass. It was on the rim. Brushed. Applied lightly. She held up a linen napkin, folded delicately. This was found beneath her chair. No lipstick, no fingerprints, but enough residue to confirm. Eleanor didn't pour the sedative herself. She looked again from face to face. Someone helped her toast to the truth, and then made sure she'd never speak another word. The room had quieted to a stillness that felt deeper than silence, something brittle, fragile. Outside, the storm began its slow retreat into drizzle, but inside the parlour, the storm had only just begun to settle. Colin's eyes had not left the folded linen napkin. His fingers clenched slightly in his lap, then relaxed again, as though rehearsing the act of surrender. Jessica stepped toward him, not confrontationally, but with a kind of soft gravity. Colin, she said, her voice even. You knew Eleanor was going to release the manuscript. She told you herself. He looked up at her, slowly. Yes. And you asked her not to. She said it was time, he murmured, not defensive, just tired. Said it wasn't just my story anymore. Said it belonged to the people it would set free. A pause. Even if it destroyed others in the process. Jessica waited. I thought I could reason with her, he continued. That night, I brought a copy of the old manuscript. I begged her to shelve it again, or at least redact some of it. She wouldn't. She offered you a drink. Number the Y poured hers. She was already sitting, making notes. She smiled, said she didn't blame me for trying to stop her, that she had once fought for truth the same way. He looked up at Jessica again, eyes shining. But she wouldn't stop. Jessica's voice was almost a whisper. So you did. Colin inhaled sharply, the sound almost catching in his chest. It wasn't meant to hurt her. It was just enough to make her sleep, to delay her. I thought maybe I could take the manuscript, leave before she woke. I didn't think... His voice cracked, and he bowed his head. I didn't think it would be permanent. No one moved. Jessica stepped closer, voice unwavering. You brushed the rim of the glass. You knew how much she trusted you. Colin nodded, slow, hollow. I didn't hate her, he said. I loved her. She believed in me when no one else did. Even when she stopped publishing me, she still read everything I sent. He looked up, eyes pleading not for forgiveness, but for understanding. I just couldn't let the world see me that way. Jessica, her heart heavy, knelt slightly beside him. It wasn't your shame she was trying to publish. It was your healing. Colin swallowed hard. Too late for that now. Jessica didn't disagree. But somewhere behind the sorrow in his eyes, she saw something else. Relief. As if he had finally released the story he had kept locked away far too long. The others had drifted from the parlour quietly, leaving only Jessica and Delia in the aftershock of Colin's confession. The fire had burned low and the clock in the hallway remained silent, as though even time needed a moment to gather itself. Jessica sat with a fresh cup of tea, her thoughts rippling like the steam rising above it. It had not been a crime of rage, not vengeance. There was no weapon, no screaming, no struggle, just fear and shame, and the soft weight of a page too honest to survive unchallenged. Delia sat across from her, shoulders drawn close, the manuscript still resting on the table between them. "He didn't mean to kill her?" she said quietly. Jessica nodded. Number but meaning doesn't change consequence. Delia looked down. She trusted him. "Yes," Jessica said, her voice gentle. And he betrayed that trust, not to harm her, but to protect the version of himself he thought was all he had left. They sat in silence for a while longer. Jessica's thoughts returned to Eleanor's final toast, one last pour to the truth. Not a punishment, a gift, one Colin hadn't yet known how to receive. She sipped her tea slowly, her mind filing away the clues that had led her here, the broken clock, the wine-stained napkin, the missing glasses, the manuscript meant to be discovered. So many secrets. And yet, in the end, the truth had not roared. It had arrived gently, through story, and through the silence that followed. Jessica looked to the hallway, where the light had dimmed to a soft dusk. There would be no dramatic arrest, only a statement, and perhaps, later, an apology written from a prison of one's own making. But sometimes, she thought, justice didn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrived like Eleanor's last words, measured, mournful, and finally heard. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the earth damp and shining. Hawthorne Hollow stood as it always had, weathered but upright, a home made of memory as much as stone. The hush inside now felt different, not the taut silence of suspicion, but something gentler, the hush of things returning to stillness. Jessica stood in the library doorway as Delia moved quietly around the room, lifting books, dusting shelves. Her movements were slow, respectful, not as someone claiming ownership, but as a steward stepping into a legacy long kept at arm's length. "I never really looked closely at these," Delia said softly, brushing a hand along the spines. They were always just part of the background. Aunt Eleanor said they were stories meant for braver times. Jessica smiled. "She was probably waiting until you were old enough to understand the weight of them." Delia turned, holding a small bundle of correspondence tied with blue ribbon. Eleanor's handwriting marked the top envelope. "She left these for me," Delia said. "Letters, some going back years. She must have known." Jessica stepped forward, her voice warm. "She did, and she trusted you with more than the house. She trusted you with the truth." Delia nodded, her expression unreadable but composed. "I'm going to open the library to the public, maybe just a few afternoons a week. People should read what she wrote, what they all wrote." Jessica watched her, heart heavy with hope. Eleanor's voice would not be silenced, not by scandal, not by fear, not now. And perhaps, in Delia's hands, Hawthorne Hollow might become not just a place where stories ended, but where they began again. The garden behind the house had grown wild with the years, lavender bushes sprawling into the gravel, ivy curling up the trellises. Eleanor had once described it to Jessica as a place for things that refused to be tamed. Now, walking through its curved pathways, Jessica saw the truth of that. She moved slowly, letting her fingers brush against leaves and petals, damp with dew. Each step was accompanied by the soft hum of morning, birdsong, distant wind, the quiet hush of a world returning to itself. There were stories here, she thought. Stories planted like seeds, half-grown, half-forgotten. Colin's regret, Meera's shame, Arthur's stubborn silence. Even Rose's hidden sorrow, buried not out of malice but out of protection. And Eleanor, always Eleanor, shaping them all, not with force but with observation. She hadn't just published books. She had edited people, refined them, sometimes wounded them in the process, but always believing, perhaps naively, that truth in any form could save. Jessica knelt by a stone bench where the hydrangeas had begun to bloom again. A withered rose lay nestled in the dirt nearby, its petals crumbling, yet still holding form. She picked it up gently, not as a clue, but as a remembrance. There had been no villains here, only people carrying more truth than they could bear. Jessica turned back toward the house, the path crunching lightly beneath her steps. Eleanor had not finished all her stories, but she had finished the most important one, and in doing so had left space for others, perhaps even Delia, to tell theirs. Jessica sat at the writing desk in her guest room, her notebook open beside her tea. The ink flowed smoothly, almost of its own accord, as she began to commit her final thoughts to paper. There is something remarkable about the truths we never say aloud. They grow heavier with time, not lighter. Eleanor knew that. She bore hers not with bitterness but with quiet resolve, waiting for the right moment to let them go. She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, where the clouds had begun to lift. In the end, it wasn't malice that took her life. It was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of reflection, but also fear of letting go of an identity forged in shadows. Colin didn't strike out in anger. He reached for control in a world unraveling around him. Jessica dipped her pen again, continuing in a slow, deliberate hand. It's easy to condemn people for what they hide. Harder to understand why they hide it. And hardest of all, to forgive ourselves for not speaking when we had the chance. She let the final sentence linger before adding one last note in the margin. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with understanding. Jessica capped her pen, closed the notebook, and let her hand rest upon it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt still, and sometimes, she thought, that was enough. As Jessica made her way downstairs for the final time, she paused in the hallway, where the grandfather clock stood tall and dignified once more. Its face gleamed softly in the filtered morning light, the hands moving in measured rhythm, ticking forward second by second, without drama or fanfare. Delia had repaired it that morning. "It deserves to keep time again," she'd said simply. Jessica placed a hand lightly against the wood, feeling the faint, steady vibration beneath her fingers. Midnight had come and passed. So had the silence that followed it. Now the house breathed again. Not perfectly, but honestly. She stepped back, gave the clock a final glance, and walked on. Behind her, the ticking continued, not as an echo of the past, but as the sound of something beginning again. In the hush that follows the truth, some wounds begin to heal, while others linger, like shadows, stretching just beyond the reach of morning light. But I still wonder, was it guilt that led to Eleanor's final hour? Or something more deeply buried, something not even the manuscript could name? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery, do share it with someone who loves a good puzzle. And don't forget to subscribe. There are always more secrets waiting to be uncovered.